In tonight's Government Insider, a risky time for federal unions. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's get right to it. Joining me right now, Joe Davidson, Federal Diary columnist at the Washington Post. Joe, you are watching a pair of bills under consideration right now in Congress, so let's start with the Federal Employee Rights Act. That's introduced by Representative Tom Price. Tell us about that one.
Well, this bill, despite its name, would really make it much more difficult for federal employees who want to exercise any rights they might have for forming a union. It would require, for example, that dues, it would prohibit dues from being collected from a federal employee's paycheck. Now, many people have, in private industry, have their union dues deducted from their paychecks, but this legislation would prohibit that. It also would make it much more difficult for federal labor organizations to organize within federal agencies by requiring a majority of all those eligible to vote to approve a union, as opposed to a majority of all those who vote in an election. Now remember, this is the way we choose presidents and members of Congress. It's not everybody, it's not a majority of everybody who is eligible to vote in a district or in a state or in the country. It's the majority of those who do vote. And so if the bar is raised so that you can only form a union if the majority of everyone eligible to vote approves it, then it's really a very high bar to cross.
Let's move on to the EPIC Act. This one has been introduced by Senator Tim Scott. Tell us what EPIC stands for and how this bill is different.
Well, it stands for End Partisan IRS Culture. Now, you'll recall the IRS has been the subject of some controversy, some of it brought on by itself, for targeting certain groups. Republicans have claimed they targeted conservative groups. Democrats have shown where there were some groups on the left side of the spectrum that were targeted as well. But in any case, there was this sense that the IRS had used its tool to focus on political groups in a way that it should not have. And so this legislation would essentially ban unions from the Internal Revenue Service, from the IRS. Now, the National Treasury Employees Union, that is their main, that's where their main membership is in the IRS. And so this would essentially end a big, cut out a big segment of the NTEU's membership. And the fear is that it not only would this affect the IRS, but if it does pass for the IRS, then this could be a jumping off board, a springboard to other agencies, and perhaps there would be other legislation in the not too distant future that might target other agencies.
The federal employee unions are arguing that Republicans are misrepresenting the phrase official time.
Right.
Explain what they mean by that.
Well, official time is where you have an employee of an agency who is also a union official, who will get paid by the government for doing work that person is doing as the union official. The reason for this is federal unions are required to represent everybody in a bargaining unit, even those employees who do not pay dues to the union. So if an employee who is not a union member has a beef or wants to file a grievance with the agency, then the union has to represent that person even though that person is not a union member. In exchange, they get what is called official time, where, as I mentioned, they will get, it could be part-time, it could be 100% of their time, but they will be paid by the agency while essentially doing some union work. But that union work includes things like talking with the agency over such items as training, safety issues, workplace efficiency. So they aren't doing basic like union organizing, but they are doing the kinds of things that presumably affect the entire workforce.
I know that you're also following another story. That is a significant staff shortage that's happening at Customs and Border Protection. The agency says that it is down to more than 2,000 officers. Tell us what kind of impact this is having on the employees who are still working there.
Well, many employees complain about long hours of overtime, sometimes 15, 16 hours. One guy told me the longest he ever worked on a straight shift was 20 hours. And they say that this is not uncommon. Now, Customs and Border Protection, their figures indicate that it might not be as frequent as the union makes it sound like. The union makes it sound like it's much more frequent than the agency says. And so just how frequently these people have to work those long hours, I think, is still to be determined. But nonetheless, it is true that on least some occasions they have to work incredibly long shifts, and the reason seems to be staff shortages.
And so is this a funding problem? Could more money fix this, or is it more complex than that?
Well, it seems like the main issue really isn't the money. To some extent it is, but the larger problem seems to be that that Customs and Border Protection has just a very long and slow hiring process. And that's really not uncommon around the country, around the government, I should say. But it's not as though everyone is working 12 to 16-hour shifts with some frequency. So the big problem, I think, even more than money, is just simply a long and slow hiring process.
All right, Joe Davidson, we appreciate it. Federal Diary columnist at the Washington Post. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.